Thank you. So I'm actually surprised that so many people came to my talk because in the other hall we are going to have a superior talk by Daniel, who is a good friend of mine. I was counting that nobody was going to show up now, so I would be able just to go and hear Daniel speak. This is me and him being very depressed by the fact that we are going to miss each other's talk today. Drinking a little bit the way we do it in Eastern Europe, in South America, in other places in the world. So yeah, disclaimer, I might have had a little too many drinks last night, and I might have slept way too little. So my train of thought is not going to be what it usually is, or it is going to be just as what it usually is. And this is some lame excuse. So we'll see. I hope that you are in the right set of mind, because you are now in the Church of Emacs, and every proper Emacs presentation begins with So when I say meta, I want you to scream back at me X. Can we try this 3 times? Meta. 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 Emacs forever. Okay, we can finally start. Bom dia a todos. I think that this is the extent of my Portuguese, and it is almost as good as my English. I actually had to learn English, especially for this talk, as typically I present in a superior language, namely Bulgarian. I know that I sound like a Russian hitman, but rest assured, if I were a hitman, and I wouldn't admit if I were, I would be a Bulgarian hitman, a significantly more little person. So this is my name in Bulgarian. You cannot read it. This is my name in English. Nobody can pronounce it, because some really bright people decided that the sound zh in English should be presented with zh. So everybody calls me either Bozhidar or Bozhidar, but Portuguese, fortunately, is a better language than English, and it has the right letter to express the right sound. So I'm Bozhidar, just like Jose is not Jose. Hopefully, you have some idea who he is. And of course, all of my friends for years have been calling me back. Yesterday, I had so many drinks with so many of you, so I guess we're all friends, and you can call me back. I came all the way from Sofia in Bulgaria, a city where we consider a skyscraper any building with over 5 stories. Really interesting. Sofia is kind of far away. I don't know if you have any idea where Bulgaria is. I can tell you that my journey here didn't take 15 hours and 40 minutes. This was a very, very optimistic estimate. It took me more like 2 days on a horseback, 3 days on a boat. I also traveled a little bit with a balloon. It was pretty wild, but I made it here. And somewhere at this point, I usually stop with my introduction and I switch to something more meaningful. But not today, because recently I became super famous in Bulgaria when I was declared to be one of the top 10 Bulgarian white hackers. First of all, I'm not white, I'm very well tanned. But you know, journalism, modern journalism really sucks. They made up all sorts of bullshit. So we had this really funny story where somebody attacked the National Revenue Agency of Bulgaria, managed to steal its entire database, uploaded it at a few torrent trackers, and leak all the financial records of all the citizens of Bulgaria, which, as you can imagine, was kind of embarrassing, but also amusing, because you could look up some people you know and get new insight about their lives. Still, the police tried to apprehend the culprits. They started arresting random people, really random people. And then this weird article appeared saying that all of the people who were arrested couldn't have hacked the NRA because they weren't one of the top 10 white hackers, whatever this means. I was surprised to see that I'm on this list. under number 7, I guess you cannot read this in Bulgarian, so I'm going to translate the highlights here. In the article, it says that I'm an expert in cybersecurity, even though I know absolutely nothing about cybersecurity. It says that I'm an expert in the following programming languages: Unix, Emacs, Perl, and Ruby. And I think that this is a really absurd statement, because who can ever be an expert in Perl? It's impossible. But the really funniest thing was that there was this completely random claim that in Bulgaria I was known as the Don Juan of IT. I had numerous girlfriends. And this really came as a surprise to my long-term girlfriend. So we had a really awkward conversation right afterwards. So yeah, lately I've been extra famous in Bulgaria. And if you have something you need, hacking, cracking, or whatever, I'm your guy. And I'm very cheap. I accept cachaça, caipirinha, other drinks, maybe something else as well. We'll see. But I'm pretty cheap and pretty excited to be here because this is my first time in Brazil. Well, technically speaking, it's my second time in Brazil, because the first time I just went to this place. I was actually in Argentina, but they told me that the pictures were much better from Brazil. So I immediately hopped on a taxi, went to Brazil, took some amazing pictures, met some amazing locals. Those were all the Brazilian natives that I met on my first visit, but they were very cute. I didn't get any real drinks except this. So yesterday I was working hard to compensate. But I can assure you that this is my first time in Sao Paulo, my first time at a conference in Brazil, in South America for this matter. So this is cool. And you might be wondering, is he going to say something about Clojure? Unfortunately, I'm not a Clojure developer. I'm a Ruby developer. And at Ruby conferences, we typically tell jokes for 35 minutes. And if it is possible, if we're feeling the right way, we might share something technical near the end. So hanging with me, I think it's going to get fun. I was wondering if there is some cultural bridge between our countries. I knew that they must be related because they all start with the letter B, Bulgaria, Brazil. That's good. So I heard that you are really into a barbecue known as churrasco or something like this, some very complicated word. And in Bulgaria, we also like barbecue. This is a traditional Bulgarian breakfast for two, a very light breakfast. I heard that in Brazil, people are all about the good life at the seaside. And surprise, surprise, in Bulgaria, we do so too. I heard that in Brazil, you have the greatest dancers in the world. But there are some good Bulgarian dancers as well. This is Victor Krum from Harry Potter. As you can see, dashingly handsome, really, really well-dressed. But we have more extreme dancers in Bulgaria. For instance, those weirdly dressed people are dancing in a very cold river on the 1st of January. I wouldn't do this. And we have people who are also dancing on fire, which seems even more weird, but we have this. In Bulgaria, as in Brazil, football is a religion. Unfortunately, we have just one good football player in the entire history of Bulgarian football. And you have many, like Ronaldo. Oh, shit. Like Ronaldo. I also found some differences. For instance, I was told that you consider 32 degrees winter, which in Bulgaria looks a little bit different. Notice the white thingy. I also noticed that there is a difference in the scale of our countries and cities. The population of Sao Paulo, depending on who you're asking, is somewhere between 12 and 22 million people. The population of Bulgaria is always 7 million people or less, because we are constantly dying. So, you know, meeting a Bulgarian is almost like meeting a leprechaun. We're so rare. So you should bask in the moment. It's unlikely to happen again. There is also another thing that bonds Brazil and Bulgaria. I don't know whether you know it or not, but the second The second biggest contributor to CIDER after me is actually Brazilian, this handsome gentleman, Artur. He couldn't make it here today, unfortunately, but I wanted to mention his contributions in front of the home audience. There is another thing that binds us. He also works at TopTo with me as a Ruby developer, but maybe we are going to change this. Probably you don't care about any of this, and here I'm going to get very serious. I do some Clojure work as well, open source, something called CIDER, and some other things like nrepo, orchard, and so on, that they're going to be the topic of this presentation. Under the artistic name of Batsov, which, surprise, surprise, stands for Bozhidar Batsov. I also do other artistic writing about Clojure and Ruby here, about Emacs only here. And I really hate React Redux because this ruined the SEO of my sites. As people Google something about Redux and they go and learn React. That's horrible. And here, I'm really starting with the presentation. I know I have to. That's a Clojure conference after all, and there are some standards. So when I say CIDER, what comes to your mind? I assume that if somebody is from North America, they might be thinking of this hot beverage for a cold winter day. If you're from Europe, you're probably going to think about a refreshing beverage for a hot summer day or for any day. It's really good. If you're into Clojure, you might be thinking about this and Emacs. But today I'm going to try to convince you that there is more to CIDER than Emacs. Thus, the subject of my presentation, CIDER Distilled, Beyond Emacs. I know that officially the name of the presentation was different, but I couldn't fit it on one slide, so I shortened it. And I think it's nicer and more symmetric right now. When we discuss CIDER, we should start with its architecture. Most people believe that CIDER is just a single piece of code, one big chunk of Emacs Lisp, happily running in Emacs, the so-called majestic monolith. This is a picture which I found online when I was Googling for a majestic monolith. I think it's really majestic. But in reality, CIDER is not a monolith. CIDER has two components, an Emacs client, which is written in Emacs Lisp indeed. This is basically the UI, the representation of all the data, interactions with the repo, and so on. But all of the magic, everything really important, is written in Clojure. CIDER makes heavy use of nrepo, which is Clojure repo server. And it extends nrepo with a set of middlewares which provide important functionality like code completion, like navigation to definitions, like the interactive debugger, the ability to reload your code, and so on. And I know what you're thinking right now. Okay, so it's not one monolith, it's two monoliths, and maybe not as majestic as we imagine them to be. But I'm going to try to make the case that the second monolith is not as monolithic as it appears, because CIDER and repo, the containing library for all those cool middlewares that I mentioned, is actually composed of many, many libraries, which I think of as CIDER orchard, because I like dumb puns, I guess. If this was a Ruby conference, and I had to explain what an orchard is, I would have just shown you this picture, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. But we're at a Clojure conference, and I feel compelled to show you a dictionary definition. So, what's an orchard? A piece of enclosed land planted with fruit trees, like an apple orchard. And recently, the Oxford English Dictionary added a second definition, a fertile ground for Clojure tooling. Sounds even more useful, although not as drinkable. But it is what it is, CIDER orchard. At the heart of the orchard, we have the nrepo library. Nrepo is both a library, a self-contained thingy that you can embed in your application, and a tool that provides you a foundation for repo power tooling. What's unique about nrepo is that it is the only repo that I'm aware of that was created with the intention to solve the common problems that a person writing a Clojure plugin for some editor or an interactive repo would have to solve. That there have been other attempts in this regard, but nrepo is really powerful because it was devised to be flexible. Chas Emerick, the original author, knew that you cannot solve all the problems from scratch from day one. But if you made it, if you made the foundation flexible, people can easily add the solutions to problems when the time comes. Thus, we have a repo which provides us the ability to communicate with it via several data encoding schemes, via several data transport protocols, which is really cool. We can add as much functionality as we want with middleware. Originally, nrepo didn't support Clojure script, but because it was extensible via middleware, with the piggyback middleware, we easily added Clojure script support with just a couple of 100 lines of Clojure code. And because it is so easy to replace one middleware with another doing the same thing, for instance, Shadow CLJS provided its own version of a Clojure script evaluation middleware, which has nothing to do with piggyback at all. I mentioned CIDER and repo earlier today. And despite the fact that CIDER and repo has CIDER in its name, it is not really CIDER specific. When you take a look at this diagram again, does any editor need code completion? Probably. Does any editor need an interactive debugger? Probably. Everything in CIDER and repo is CIDER agnostic. I like to think of it as not as piece of CIDER, but as a common foundation for Clojure tooling for building interactive programming environments like CIDER that happens to be named CIDER something. Internally, CIDER nrepo is just a thin wrapper around many nrepo agnostic libraries. This wasn't always the case. At a certain part of CIDER nrepo's history, a lot of functionality was hard-baked into CIDER, but with the advent of alternative repos, alternatives of nrepo, we moved this all out to another library that I'm going to mention now. So this is available to people using other repos. So let me pause for a moment to tell you a little bit about building programming tools, the development productivity tools. That there are two fundamental approaches that you can take when you're building something like CIDER. So you can do it the repo-driven way by introspecting the runtime of your application, constantly checking things like metadata, what are the vars that are defined in the runtime, and so on. This is basically what CIDER does. Or you can do static analysis of the code. You can get some parser, build abstract syntax trees, representations of the code in your project, and use the ASTs to figure out where things are defined, and so on. The two approaches are not mutually exclusive. Usually they are combined to some degree, because if you're using just static analysis, you cannot evaluate code. You cannot do things like macro expansion and so on. If you're doing just the repo-driven way, you are going to encounter certain limitations when you're implementing functionality like find usages, find and replace, and so on. So CIDER mixes a little bit of static analysis-based approach with refactor and repo that we are going to mention in a bit. During the course of the presentation, I'm going to use mostly nrepo in the examples, but for repo power tooling, the fundamentals are the same regardless of whether you're using unrepo, prepo, nrepo, or some other yet to be developed repo. You're going to need exactly the same libraries to get the functionality that you need. And the only thing that is going to differ is the communication layer, how exactly you structure the request to the repo server, and so on. So what what I'm showing now is going to be applicable to any environment. I mentioned to you that in the early days of CIDER and repo, a lot of functionality lived in CIDER and repo itself. All this functionality was moved to a new library called Orchard. We think of it as the Swiss Army knife of tooling. If you're building some editor plugin or some interactive repo environment, probably you're going to need this because it reconciles the many differences between Clojure script and Java in a consistent API that I believe is reasonably well documented and easy to use. This is augmented by Complement, which is a code completion library. When you put in a project Orchard and Complement, I guess you're going to have most of the functionality that an IDE like tool is going to need. Complement has one limitation. It doesn't support Clojure script, at least not yet. So we have one other support library called COJS tooling, which used to do many things. Now most of them live in Orchard. The important thing about it is that we are using it for a Clojure script called completion in CIDER. And you see in other IDEs, so yes, sorry about this. That there is the profile library that we are using to power the interactive profiler in CIDER. We are using FIP and budget to provide better, faster printing of your code, of your data structures. And there are several other support libraries that me and CIDER's team are not much involved with, but they are very useful. We are relying on COJFNT for code formatting, on tools namespace for code reloading, on tools trace for tracing the evaluation of functions, on tools reader for formatting Eden, and so on. And here I'm going to make another small segue into how repo-powered tooling works. When we ended up in this situation where we had CIDER and repo depending on many libraries, we noticed that this is causing some problems for our end users because repo-powered tooling runs in the same process as your application. So the libraries that you are using to write your application and your application are loaded in the same JVM. This is obviously problematic because if you have the same dependencies in, say, CIDER and repo and in your project, probably you're going to run into dependency conflicts. That's why we've developed a tool that handles dependency inlining. It's called Mr. Anderson. The tool was created for CIDER, but it is completely agnostic. You can use it to inline dependencies into any project. It basically takes the target library, copies it into the code tree of your project, changes its namespace, and thus eliminates any conflicts. It's not pretty, but it gets the job done, and I think that this is a very useful tool. By now, you have probably noticed that there is a lot going on under the hood of CIDER. It seemed as a simple tool, something that is just an Emacs plugin maybe, but it turns out that this is much more complex than this. And we still haven't mentioned a single Emacs library. So it seems that there is something about CIDER beyond Emacs, right? And it turns out that there is even more. For instance, in CIDER's team, we maintain an alternative of tools trace named CID. This is a very powerful debugger and tracer. It has an official frontend only for Emacs, and probably this is why we ended up maintaining this, but it is a cool general purpose tool. We are also maintaining the original Clojure script repo Weasel, or the second original because the original was Austin. I guess nobody uses it these days because Figwheel, Shadow, but somebody has to take care of our ancestors, and we are doing this within CIDER's team. We are also maintaining the huge refactor and repo project, which extends CIDER with a lot of functionality based mostly on static code analysis. Refactor and repo has so many dependencies and so many features that it could be the subject of another talk. Trust me, It's complex, but it's also very useful. And I guess that it is safe to say at this point that this escalated quite a lot. And to tie into yesterday's keynote, Dr. Watson would agree with me. And a person might start to wonder, okay, so it seems that a lot of work was done to create this common foundation for Clojure tooling, but what is the result? Are others actually using any of this work? I think that the best example that we can give today is Calva, which is relatively new plugin to do Clojure development in VS Code. Calva, the name comes from the word Calvados, which is a really potent apple brandy. I love it, but it's dangerous, so be warned. In real life, Calvados is distilled from cider. And in the Clojure world, Calva is quite literally distilled from cider. Like it uses absolutely everything that cider uses, one-to-one, and it just replaces the Emacs frontend with a VS Code frontend. And I think that the result is pretty good. When we venture into the realm of Emacs's arch nemesis Vim, we have the main Vim tools, Vim Fireplace, Vim Iced, and Acid Vim using nrepo and cider nrepo. So it seems we're doing something right. It also seems that Vim users are really obsessed with Clojure plugins because they have so many of them. The now defunct counterclockwise IDE based on Eclipse also was using nrepo and cider nrepo, and I really hope that one of those days somebody is going to pick it up because it was a cool project. Protorepo, an Atom plugin, also was based on nrepo and could have used cider nrepo if it was still under maintenance. I think it was another cool project that died too young, but that's open source. And there are many non-nrepo tools out there that deserve a mention, like the new Atom plugin, Chlorine, Conjure, another Vim plugin, and Vimpire, another Vim plugin. How many plugins do you need? Cursive is the best example of a tool that is doing mostly static analysis, but it uses usually nrepo for the actual code evaluation. It can use other repos as well. And very recently, we got an implementation of a language server protocol for Clojure, which is a cross-editor tool, of course, that is relying exclusively on static analysis. So you have to combine it with something else to do code evaluation and the things that you cannot do with static analysis. So to sum it up, it seems that our work so far gave some results. Other tool writers see value in it. I really regret in hindsight not naming Cider nrepo, Orchard nrepo, and CLJS tooling Orchard CLJS to distance them a little bit from Cider and to make it more apparent that those libraries have nothing to do with Cider. But you know, naming is hard. At least, as I mentioned earlier, we are fixing part of the problem as CLJS tooling is going to be discontinued in the months to come. A part of it already lives in the newest Orchard release, and the rest of it is going to be merged in Complement. So Complement is going to support both Clojure and Clojure Script, starting with version 0.4, which I think is really cool. So I don't know. Maybe we can assume that Cider's Orchard is actually Clojure's Orchard because the entire Clojure community can benefit from it. Just maybe. And here's a small case study to highlight how important it is to have a common foundation, like how we recently improved Clojure script code completion for everybody. I mentioned how we merged CLJS tooling in Complement. There isn't a stable release, but when there is, everybody who is depending on Complement is getting Clojure scripts support for free. And even more powerful example, CLJ Suitable recently implemented a much smarter code completion algorithm for Clojure script. And Okay, let me give you a moment to see the candidates. They're much better than you would normally see today in Calva, in CIDER. We integrated this library into um, into CIDER and repo, and immediately for free, out of nowhere, all of the tools relying on CIDER and repo got this smarter code completion support. I think this is really powerful, and it doesn't get much better than this. I left some slide intentionally blank. I guess I was about to say something very deep and profound. Let me check what it is. Okay. The elephant in the room today is the language server protocol. People have been asking me for a while, is there a point to be building some tooling around nrepo, around those orchard libraries, or call them whatever, if we have the language server protocol, and supposedly it's going to be the one true king, all of the editors are going to kneel and yield to its will. I think that the question LSP versus nrepo, or any repo for this matter, is very nuanced. This can be the subject of a presentation in its own right, but in general, you are not prescribed to implement an LSP server in any particular way. So you can implement it in terms of a repo, or you can implement it in terms of static code analysis. You can run them side by side. You can use some things like find usages and so on from LSP, and rely on the rest of the functionality like debugging, macro expansion, tracing, and all of this based on repo power tooling, because it is much easier and much more reliable to implement it in this manner. And last but not least, ultimately, so some libraries are going to be shared in the two approaches, depending on what you chose as the implementation for LSP. I'm personally not a big fan of LSP, but I don't have time to speak about this. If you're curious why I don't like it, we can discuss it after the talk. At any rate, I really love this tweet by the late founder of Erlang, Joe Armstrong, about the groundhog development method. And I feel that every time something new jumps at the scene and everybody starts excited to rewrite all the projects, make them simple again, and so on, we are living a Groundhog Day moment. The introduction of LSP certainly represents one such moment for Clojure tooling, but I definitely don't think that the existing tooling is complex. I definitely don't think that there are some serious problems with it that LSP is going to solve for us. And ultimately, in the end of the day, the Clojure community has to implement LSP tooling, because trust me, that this is not going to come from Microsoft or from Oracle, as they have no stake in our community. And that being said, what is the state of our community? What are the challenges that we are facing? Well, a very big problem that I experience every day is that it seems that everybody except Notepad users want better Clojure development tools. But it also seems that very few people are willing to work on those better Clojure development tools. And this makes me sad, because we have very few maintainers working on many libraries, and that there are many areas of interest that can definitely benefit from some work, but there is nobody to do this work. For instance, these days, CIDER and three-factor and repo are almost unsupported. On the Clojure script side, we are really struggling, because I'm not much of a Clojure script programmer myself, and this goes for many of the core contributors to CIDER and the Orchards projects. So we can really use some help with projects like Piggyback, like the Clojure script aspects of CIDER and repo, Orchard, Complement, Weasel. It's hard. We simply don't have the capacity for this. A lot of people have been talking about hammock time, nicotine time, Conheça time and other times. But I really don't have this time. And as a result, many things are not happening the way they would normally happen, simply because I didn't have the time to think about this carefully. I just had to make some progress. The result is that we have some inconsistent APIs here and there. The documentation, while good by the standards of the Clojure community, is not as good as I wanted it to be. But still, lately, all of the projects got published on CLJ doc. I created a brand new documentation portal for CIDER. I created a brand new documentation portal for NREPO. And I think that those were two nice steps in the right direction. In the process, I learned that Markdown sucks and ASCII doc is the way. So I can heartily recommend to everybody looking to document stuff to check out the magical combination of ASCII doc plus Antora. Really, really cool tools. Funding, or the lack of funding, if I have to be precise, has always been a painful topic. No, not for CIDER and the related projects so much, but about open source in general. For the first 5 years when I was working on CIDER and repo and all the jazz, I estimate the projects received less than $5,000 in donations, and I worked at least 3,000 hours on them. So it seems that I made a very bad deal, right? There is a lot of hidden work when you are working on an open source project. People are thinking, okay, this person is just churning out code every day and maybe debugging some issues from time to time, but you have to review code, you have to discuss ideas. We are discussing so many ideas with so many people. I have to educate myself constantly to become smart enough to understand the ideas of other people. I have to provide support to end users via Slack, via email. I have to collaborate with other two authors like the people from Fireplace, the people from Calva, and so on. In 2018, things kind of picked up. First, Clojure is together, surprisingly for me, decided to support CIDER, which was the first sizable donation to the project. Later this year, I also created an open collective, which got a little bit of donations, still insignificant funding. This year, probably because I was complaining about this at way too many conferences, people started donating a little bit more, but still, this is a drop in the pond. If you do the numbers, that's something like $2,000 per month before taxes. Who would actually be working on this full time? And we need several people to be working on this, not just one. That there are really many libraries. I'm really disappointed that no Clojure company, big or small, have supported the Orchards projects in any significant way. And I fail to see the reasoning of the companies. Companies are willing to spend money easily to hire 100 more developers, 200 more developers, but they're not willing to do a high leverage investment into better development tooling, because if they manage to get the current tools to make you more productive by, say, 20%, 30%, this would mean that they have to shell out significantly less money down the road for new engineers. Clojure is together, as I mentioned, were a big help. There is some countdown, 35 seconds. I think I'm over time. Open Collective, CIDER, nothing works. But I'll see if I can wrap in 26 seconds. The future of the Orchard, hopefully sustainable. Hopefully somebody is going to fund it. If there is funding, there is going to be stability and prosperity. The community is key. Open source is not about you, if you ask Rich, but I fully disagree, because everything I've always been doing is all about the community, all about you. So, by helping this, you're helping yourself. Oh, perfect timing. I'm surprised. I do have some hidden slides. I cheated. There are some resources that you can read later. And there is one small announcement to make. Earlier today, I cut a new CIDER release, CIDER 0.22 Lima. Okay, this doesn't sound right. I renamed it to Sao Paulo in honor of you, in honor of this conference. So go celebrate, go have fun, go create. Go get some stickers from there.